When a life-saving act turns two strangers' worlds upside down, everything changes. Chloe, a kind-hearted waitress who spends her free time helping at a local shelter, finds herself on the receiving end of cruel treatment from Margaret, a wealthy socialite, during a busy shift at a luxury restaurant. But when a sudden emergency leaves Margaret gasping for breath, it's Chloe who steps in to save her life. This moment sparks an unlikely journey of change and self-reflection. Margaret, shaken and humbled, begins to question her shallow lifestyle, while Chloe struggles to believe that people like Margaret can truly change. As they work together to support the shelter, new bonds form. But can Margaret truly leave her old ways behind? Comment below with where you're watching from and your thoughts on how this story will unfold. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories like this one. Chloe Parker stepped into the break room of Maison d'Elegance, her breath escaping in a cloud as she adjusted to the warmth inside. Outside, autumn had begun to paint the streets of the city in gold and crimson, but inside the restaurant, it was all crisp white linens and polished silverware. Chloe tugged at her apron, smoothing out the creases that had appeared during her rushed commute. The small break room smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies, a humble space compared to the opulence of the dining room beyond. She took a moment to adjust her tie in the streaked mirror, pulling her hair back into a neat ponytail. There was a quiet determination in her dark eyes as she prepared herself for another long shift. She thought of her schedule for the next day, her volunteer work at Safe Haven, a homeless shelter where she spent every free moment she could spare. In many ways, her life felt like a tightrope walk between two worlds. Here she worked among expensive wines and high thread count tablecloths, catering to the city's elite, who often never spared her more than a passing glance. But at the shelter, Chloe was seen, appreciated, respected for the simple things she did. The faces of the people she helped, grateful mothers, kids clutching her hand, flashed through her mind, giving her the strength she needed for the night ahead. She pocketed her phone, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the dining room, where the clink of silverware and the hum of subdued conversations filled the air. Here, among patrons who discussed art acquisitions and private school admissions, Chloe was just another uniformed figure in the background. Maison d'Elegance was the kind of place where even the chandeliers had stories. Handcrafted in Paris, imported specifically to lend a certain old-world charm to the modern restaurant. Each table was carefully arranged with crystal glasses that gleamed under the soft glow of candlelight. Velvet curtains lined the windows, offering glimpses of the bustling city outside, where ordinary people hurried through the cold, bundled up against the wind. As Chloe moved through the restaurant, she noticed familiar faces, corporate executives, trust fund heirs, and socialites who treated dining out as a form of theater, their voices hushed, yet always carrying a hint of self-importance. Chloe had become adept at reading the subtle cues of these patrons, a slight lift of a hand, a barely there nod that meant they needed another glass of wine. She navigated this world like an invisible thread, careful not to draw attention to herself while ensuring everything ran smoothly. "Good evening, Mr. Lane. Your usual table?" Chloe asked with a warm smile as a gray-haired gentleman entered, offering her a distracted nod. She led him to a corner booth, where he could peruse the stock market on his tablet in peace. It was a dance she knew well, one that she had perfected over years of service. Yet in moments between orders, Chloe's mind drifted to the faces she'd see at the shelter tomorrow. The new family that had arrived the previous week, a mother with two little boys who clung to her legs as if afraid she might disappear. Chloe had seen the shadows under the mother's eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of trying to keep it all together. Chloe had managed to find an extra blanket for them last time, and she wondered if they were staying warm in the drafty dormitory. Her thoughts were interrupted by Ben, the restaurant manager, who appeared at her side with his usual hurried energy. "Chloe, Table 7's asking about the wine pairings again. Think you can help them out?" "Of course," Chloe replied, her professional smile slipping back into place. Ben nodded, already moving on to the next task. He was always respectful toward Chloe, but she knew he walked a fine line, accommodating the patrons while making sure the staff didn't lose their footing. As she approached Table 7, where a middle-aged couple was discussing vacation homes in the Hamptons, Chloe adjusted her demeanor, slipping seamlessly into the role expected of her. May I recommend the Cabernet Sauvignon, sir? It complements the filet mignon beautifully. The man barely glanced at her as he nodded his approval, but his wife offered Chloe a tight smile, murmuring, "Thank you, dear." It was a small kindness, but it kept Chloe moving through the night with a little less weight on her shoulders. The night had settled into its rhythm when the doors of Maison d'Elegance swung open, letting in a gust of chilly wind. Chloe glanced up and saw Margaret Wells stride in, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. Margaret was a fixture at the restaurant, always arriving with a group of equally well-heeled friends, always expecting the best. She never reserved a table. Her presence was a given, a silent expectation that a seat would be ready whenever she decided to grace the restaurant with her presence. Tonight she was dressed in a sleek red dress, her blonde hair styled into soft waves that framed her perfectly made-up face. Diamonds glinted at her ears, catching the light with every turn of her head. Behind her, her entourage trailed in, Hannah Green, with her hesitant smile, Lily Adams, who always seemed lost in thought, and Claire Baker, whose sharp tongue matched her sharp features. The maître d', Alex, met them at the door, offering a respectful bow. "Miss Wells, your usual table is ready?" Margaret barely acknowledged him with a flick of her manicured hand. Yes, thank you, Alex. We expect everything to be perfect tonight." Chloe, having noticed the commotion, quickly moved toward their table, bracing herself for the evening's challenges. She had served Margaret and her friends enough times to know what was coming. They had a reputation for being demanding, their voices often carried through the dining room with an edge of condescension. As Chloe approached, Margaret's gaze settled on her, raking over her uniform with a critical eye. "Oh, it's you again, Chloe," she said with a tight-lipped smile. "Still working here, I see?" "Yes, ma'am," Chloe replied, keeping her voice polite and steady. "Good evening, ladies. I'll be your server tonight. May I start you off with some wine or perhaps our house champagne?" Margaret's friends exchanged smirks, and Claire leaned forward, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "House champagne? Please, Chloe, do we look like we drink anything less than the best? Bring us your most expensive bottle." Chloe nodded, taking down the order with practiced calm. "Of course. I'll be right back." As she turned to head toward the bar, she heard Margaret murmur behind her, loud enough for Chloe to catch. "Can you believe they let just anyone work here? I mean, really, standards must be slipping." Claire's laughter rang out in response, and Hannah's face flushed with discomfort, though she kept her gaze averted. Lily offered a faint smile that barely reached her eyes. Chloe's steps quickened as she made her way back to the bar, feeling the weight of their words pressing down on her. Back at the bar, Chloe waited as the bartender poured the champagne, her mind drifting back to the shelter once more. She thought of the teenage boy she'd met last week, a kid named Jordan who had recently aged out of the foster care system. He had seemed so tough on the outside, his arms covered in tattoos, but Chloe had seen the fear behind his bravado when he admitted he had nowhere else to go. She'd found him a pair of winter boots from the donation closet, and he had given her a tentative smile that stayed with her long after she left. That was why she kept going back to Safe Haven, even after long shifts at the restaurant. It reminded her that not everyone saw her as invisible, that she had the power to make a real difference, even in small ways. It kept her grounded, even when she felt like she was fading into the background at Maison d'Elegance. As Chloe returned to Margaret's table with the champagne, she steeled herself for the next round of remarks. She poured the bubbly into their glasses with careful precision, feeling the tension tightened in her shoulders as the women continued their conversation, their voices tinged with derision. Margaret raised her glass, examining the bubbles with a critical eye. "Well, I suppose this will do," she said, taking a small sip before setting the glass down with a dismissive shrug. "But really, Chloe, I do hope you're not expecting a big tip. After all, isn't this just part of your job?" Chloe met Margaret's gaze evenly, refusing to let the hurt show. "My goal is to make sure you have a pleasant experience, ma'am," she replied softly, stepping back from the table. As she moved away, she caught Hannah's troubled glance, as if the other woman wanted to say something, but didn't quite have the courage. After dropping off another order, Chloe slipped into the kitchen for a quick break, leaning against the cool steel of the counter. The noise of the kitchen was a welcome contrast to the refined hum of the dining room, the clatter of pots, and the hiss of the stove offering a kind of chaotic comfort. Carlos, the line cook, looked up from the grill and gave her a sympathetic smile. He was a wiry man with a quick wit and a heart of gold, and he had become something of a big brother to Chloe over the years. "You holding up, Chloe?" She managed a tired smile, though the strain showed in her eyes. "Yeah, it's one of those nights." Carlos shook his head, his expression darkening. "It's always one of those nights when that crowd comes in. They don't see you, Chloe, but I do. And I know the people at the shelter see you too." Chloe's smile grew a little less forced. "Thanks, Carlos. I just need to get through this shift, and then I'll head to the shelter tomorrow. That's what matters." Carlos nodded, flipping a steak with practiced ease. "Just remember, those folks out there might have all the money in the world, but they've got nothing on your heart." Chloe felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, and she stood a little straighter. She had faced far worse challenges than a few condescending customers. She just needed to focus on the bigger picture. Back in the dining room, the evening moved forward, the tension between Chloe and Margaret's table building with every interaction. Chloe served their entrees with the same professional care she offered to every guest, but Margaret seemed determined to find fault with every little thing. The steak was too rare, the risotto was too cold, the lighting was too dim. "Honestly, I don't know how you manage, Chloe," Margaret remarked with a smirk as she sent back her plate for the second time. "I'd go crazy if I had to deal with people like us all day." Claire snickered beside her, taking another sip of champagne. "Yeah, Chloe, do you ever just wish you'd, I don't know, done something more with your life?" Hannah and Lily shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly embarrassed by the remarks but not willing to speak up. Chloe felt her chest tight, but she forced herself to maintain her composure, reminding herself that this was nothing compared to the real struggles people faced at the shelter. She thought of Jordan, of the tired mother with her two boys, of the elderly couple who always sat together at the corner table, holding hands even as they navigated their uncertain future. Their faces gave her strength, reminding her that the opinions of people like Margaret didn't define her. With a small, steady breath, Chloe lifted her chin and looked Margaret in the eye. "Is there anything else I can get for you, ma'am?" she asked calmly, refusing to let her voice waver. Margaret seemed taken aback by Chloe's composure, but she quickly masked it with a dismissive wave. "No, I think you've done quite enough. Just try not to mess up our desserts, would you?" Chloe nodded, turning away as Margaret's laughter rang out behind her. She moved toward the kitchen with her back straight, her head held high, determined not to let them see the hurt they'd caused. As the evening drew on, the dining room began to thin out, and Chloe took a moment to catch her breath at the service station. She watched Margaret's table from a distance, noticing the subtle shifts in the group's dynamic. Hannah's averted gaze, Lily's quiet unease, even a hint of tension in Claire's usually smug expression. She wondered if there might be more to these women than the privileged exteriors they presented. But she quickly pushed the thought aside, reminding herself that change was rare, especially in people who believed they were untouchable. Still, a small part of her couldn't help but hope that one day they might see the world differently. As she prepared the last of the dessert orders, Chloe glanced over at Carlos, who offered her a quick thumbs up. She managed a tired but genuine smile in return. Tomorrow she will be back at the shelter, where her efforts would make a tangible difference. And that thought made the weight of this night a little easier to bear. As the night grew darker outside, Maison d'Elegance hummed with the quiet murmur of well-heeled patrons. Chloe moved between tables with her usual precision, her mind balancing the complexities of wine pairings and dessert orders, while keeping a polite smile fixed on her face. But with each trip back to Margaret's table, the tension continued to thicken, like a string pulled tighter and tighter, on the verge of snapping. Margaret and her friends had moved from complaints about the food to outright snide remarks about Chloe herself. It started small, with Claire tapping the edge of her wine glass to draw Chloe's attention. When Chloe hurried over, she was met with Claire's sly smile. "Chloe, this wine doesn't taste quite right. Are you sure you poured it properly?" Chloe swallowed back a retort. "I'm sorry if it's not to your taste, ma'am. Would you like me to bring a different bottle?" "Oh, don't worry, dear," Claire replied, her tone dripping with mock concern. "It's probably not your fault. I mean, someone like you wouldn't know a fine vintage from a cheap blend." Margaret's laughter rang out, drawing glances from nearby tables. Hannah looked as if she might say something, but she quickly busied herself with adjusting her napkin. Lily's smile faltered, but she didn't speak up either. Chloe clenched her jaw and offered a stiff nod before retreating to the safety of the bar. Behind the counter, Chloe let out a slow breath, focusing on the familiar movements of organizing glasses and wiping down surfaces. Ben, the restaurant manager, passed by and gave her a sympathetic look. "They're tough tonight, huh?" he murmured under his breath, casting a glance toward Margaret's table. "They're just in a mood," Chloe replied, forcing a smile. "I'll manage." "You always do," Ben said with a nod, though his expression was tight with concern. "But if it gets out of hand, let me know. I'll step in." Chloe shook her head. She had dealt with difficult customers before, far worse than this. But there was something about the way Margaret's laughter sliced through the air tonight, like a dagger aimed straight at her heart, that made it harder to brush off. Still, she reminded herself of the people she'd be helping tomorrow at the shelter, and it steadied her enough to return to the dining room. When Chloe brought out the dessert menus, Margaret seized the opportunity to take another jab, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. "Tell me, Chloe, what's the most impressive thing you've ever done? I mean, besides bringing us champagne?" The question caught Chloe off guard, and she hesitated for a moment, thinking of her volunteer work, the long nights at the shelter when she helped families find some semblance of comfort in their most desperate moments. But she knew better than sharing something so personal with Margaret. "I just try to do my job well, ma'am," Chloe replied carefully, handing each of them a menu. "Oh, come on," Margaret pressed, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "There must be something. Do you have any hobbies, or is work all you know?" Chloe bit back the urge to snap. Instead, she focused on keeping her voice steady as she replied, "I'm passionate about helping others, ma'am. It's important to me." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "How quaint. You know, some of us are passionate about, well, bigger things." Claire chuckled at Margaret's comment, but Hannah and Lily exchanged a glance, their expressions uncertain. For a moment, Margaret's bravado faltered, a flicker of something like confusion crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Anyway, I hope you don't think we're going to give you a big tip just because you have a good heart." Chloe stiffened but kept her smile in place. "I'm just here to ensure you enjoy your evening, ma'am." Margaret's expression hardened, as if Chloe's refusal to react had stung more than any retort could have. Chloe moved away from the table, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had glimpsed a crack in Margaret's armor, something hidden beneath the surface, struggling to break free. As the night wore on, the tension continued to mount. Other tables had begun to take notice of Margaret's increasingly loud comments, their glances lingering on Chloe with expressions of sympathy or quiet disapproval. The restaurant's elegant atmosphere felt charged with an undercurrent of unease. Margaret seemed to feed off the attention, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms with a smirk as she watched Chloe clear their plates. "You know, Chloe, I bet you've never even traveled outside this city, have you? It must feel so small. You should try getting out sometime." Chloe paused, her hands tightening around the tray she held. She thought of the places she had dreamed of visiting as a child: Paris, New Orleans, the Grand Canyon. But those dreams had been set aside long ago, sacrificed to the realities of rent and bills and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Margaret's smile widened as she caught Chloe's hesitation. "Or maybe you're just happy right where you are, waiting tables forever. It's, admirable in a way. A simpler life." Claire chuckled, but Hannah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing toward Chloe with a frown. "Margaret, maybe we should just—" "Oh, relax, Hannah," Margaret interrupted, her tone dismissive. "We're just having a little fun. Right, Chloe?" Chloe forced a smile, but her chest burned with the weight of unspoken words. "If there's nothing else you need, ma'am, I'll just—" Before she could finish, Margaret's glass of wine tipped over, spilling red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. Claire laughed, but it was a hollow sound, and even Lily looked down at her hands. her expression troubled. Margaret waved a hand at Chloe with an exaggerated sigh. Oops, looks like we need someone to clean that up. Chloe set down her tray with a shaky breath, grabbing a cloth napkin and kneeling beside the table to blot at the spreading stain. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and the weight of the humiliation they intended for her. But she focused on her breathing, trying to keep the anger at bay. She thought of Jordan, the young man at the shelter, and how he had looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear when she told him about the resources available to him. She wasn't doing this for Margaret or for the tip. She was doing it because she knew who she was, and that had to be enough. As Chloe finished cleaning up the mess, she heard a soft voice behind her. Chloe, can you bring us some more bread, please? Chloe glanced up, surprised to see that it was Lily who had spoken. There was a note of gentleness in Lily's expression, a flicker of something that Chloe couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or shame. Chloe nodded, grateful for the small reprieve, and hurried to the kitchen to fetch a fresh basket of bread. When she returned, Lily offered her a small smile. Thank you, Chloe. Chloe hesitated, then nodded, acknowledging the gesture without letting herself read too much into it. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a night like this, she would take whatever small moments of kindness she could find. Margaret, however, seemed to notice the exchange, her expression tightening as she glanced between Chloe and Lily. She straightened in her chair, her tone growing colder as she addressed Chloe again. Make sure the next course is up to standard, Chloe. We wouldn't want another mishap. Chloe inclined her head, keeping her expression neutral. Of course, ma'am. Chloe moved through the rest of the dinner service on autopilot, her mind buzzing with a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. As she served the last round of desserts, she heard Margaret's voice cut through the air, addressing her with the same haughty tone. Chloe, before you run off again, I have a question for you. What do you do when you're not here? Wait, let me guess. Watching TV in a tiny apartment? Chloe froze, feeling the sting of Margaret's words. But before she could respond, a sharp gasp broke the air, followed by the clatter of a fork hitting the table. Chloe turned to see Margaret clutching her throat, her face flushing an alarming shade of red. Her eyes widened in panic as she struggled to draw a breath, her hands fluttering uselessly at her neck. Claire and Hannah sprang to their feet, their expressions turning from amusement to horror in an instant. Oh my God, Margaret, are you okay? Hannah cried, her voice rising in pitch as Margaret's breathing grew more labored. Lily reached out to touch Margaret's arm, her face pale with fear. She's choking. Someone do something. The room fell silent, the other diners frozen in their seats, unsure how to react. Chloe's heart leapt into her throat, but she forced herself to focus, to push down the fear and panic that threatened to overwhelm her. This was just like the emergencies she'd handled at the shelter. Moments when she had to keep calm, when someone else's life depended on her ability to act. Without a second thought, Chloe rushed forward, positioning herself behind Margaret's chair. Stand back, she ordered, her voice steady and firm. The other women scrambled away from Margaret, their faces masks of helpless terror. Chloe's mind cleared as she wrapped her arms around Margaret's midsection, placing her hands just above the navel and locking them together. She could feel Margaret's body convulsing with each desperate attempt to breathe, and she tightened her grip, drawing on the strength she had developed through years of volunteer work. With swift, powerful thrusts, Chloe performed the Heimlich maneuver, her movements precise and controlled. Each second felt like an eternity as she prayed that she wasn't too late. She could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on her, the weight of their collective hope and fear pressing down on her shoulders. Just as panic began to claw at the edges of her mind, Margaret suddenly coughed violently, a piece of food flying from her mouth and landing on the white tablecloth. Margaret gasped, sucking in a deep, shuddering breath as the color began to return to her face. Chloe held on for a moment longer, helping Margaret steady herself before releasing her grip. She took a step back, her hands shaking as she watched Margaret recover. The room erupted in a wave of applause, the sound washing over them like a tidal wave. Margaret's friends gathered around her, their faces pale with shock and relief. Margaret turned to look at Chloe, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something else, something that Chloe couldn't quite identify. You saved me, Margaret whispered, her voice rough and strained. Chloe nodded, offering a small, tight smile. Just take deep breaths, ma'am. You're okay now. As Chloe turned away, the applause continued to swell around her, but she hardly registered it. She made her way back to the kitchen, her legs trembling with adrenaline. Carlos met her at the door, his eyes wide with admiration. Chloe, that was amazing. You saved her life. Chloe shook her head, struggling to find her voice. I just did what I had to do. Ben appeared beside them, clapping Chloe on the shoulder with a proud smile. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. You kept your cool, Chloe. I'm impressed. Chloe managed a nod, but her mind was already spinning with the implications of what had just happened. She had seen a shift in Margaret's expression, a flash of something that went deeper than gratitude. But whether it meant anything, Chloe couldn't yet say. As she leaned against the counter, catching her breath, Chloe felt a small, fragile hope bloom in her chest. Maybe tonight would change more than she had imagined. Maybe it was the beginning of something different. The applause eventually died down, but the charged atmosphere lingered in the restaurant. Margaret remained seated, her breathing still unsteady as she processed what had just happened. Her hands shook as she sipped water from a glass that Hannah held out for her. Claire hovered nearby, looking more lost than Chloe had ever seen her. Lily's face was drawn with concern, her usual aloofness replaced by something almost like fear. Chloe retreated to the back of the dining room, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. She heard murmurs ripple through the remaining diners, some of them praising her quick actions, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. She really saved her life, didn't she? I've never seen anything like it. That waitress, she's a hero. Chloe caught Ben's eye across the room. He gave her a proud nod, but there was an unspoken question in his gaze. Are you okay? She managed a small nod in return, but the weight of what had happened was starting to settle into her bones. She felt raw, exposed, as if she had laid herself bare before the entire restaurant. She had acted instinctively, and now that the danger had passed, she wasn't sure what came next. As Chloe headed back to the kitchen, she caught a final glimpse of Margaret's table. Margaret's usual veneer of haughty confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted look in her eyes. She watched Chloe as if seeing her for the first time, as if the walls between them had suddenly become paper thin. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Chloe thought she saw something like gratitude, or maybe regret, flicker in Margaret's eyes. But then she turned away, disappearing through the kitchen doors before she could think too much about it. Later that night, after most of the diners had left and the restaurant was beginning to close, Margaret sat alone at her table, her friends standing awkwardly around her. They had suggested calling a car or going to the hospital for a checkup, but Margaret waved them off, insisting that she just needed a moment to catch her breath. In truth, she felt like she needed more than just a moment. She needed to understand how her entire world had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. Her mind kept replaying the sensation of choking, the terrifying realization that she couldn't breathe, that she might die right there in that chair. And through it all, she remembered the strong, steady hands that had saved her. Chloe's hands. Margaret stared down at the pristine tablecloth, now stained with a splotch of wine and the remnants of her dessert. She felt a wave of shame wash over her as she thought of all the things she had said to Chloe that night, how she had treated her like nothing more than a servant, a source of amusement. And yet, when her life had hung in the balance, Chloe had stepped in without a moment's hesitation. Hannah reached out and squeezed Margaret's shoulder gently. You sure you're okay, Maggie? Margaret flinched at the touch but managed a nod. I'm fine, I just need to think. Claire shifted uncomfortably, frowning as she glanced toward the empty bar. Can you believe she actually knew how to do that? I mean, who would have thought? Lily shot Claire a sharp look, her voice uncharacteristically firm. Maybe it's not so surprising. People aren't always what they seem. Margaret swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat wouldn't go away. She waved them off again, forcing a smile that she hoped would reassure them. Go on home, all of you. I'll be fine. Hannah hesitated, but eventually she nodded and left with Claire and Lily, their footsteps echoing down the marble floor. Margaret stayed behind, the restaurant's dimmed lights casting long shadows across the empty tables. Margaret eventually gathered her things and slipped out of the restaurant through the side door, not wanting to face any of the staff on her way out. The cool night air hit her like a slap, clearing the fog from her mind as she walked to her car, the heels of her designer shoes clicking against the pavement. She slid into the driver's seat of her sleek black sedan, but she didn't start the engine right away. Instead, she stared out through the windshield, her mind replaying the moment when she had gasped for air, feeling the world narrow to a single point of terror. In the safety of her car, Margaret allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding all night. Chloe had saved her life, and in doing so, she had exposed something that Margaret had spent years trying to hide from herself, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of luxury or status could fill. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, her hands trembling. For the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable, her carefully constructed facade cracking around the edges. She thought of Chloe's steady hands, her calm voice. She thought of the look in Chloe's eyes. Disdain, yes, but something deeper too. Compassion, strength. Margaret swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat and finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine purring to life. She drove home in silence, the city lights blurring outside her window as she tried to make sense of the turmoil inside her. When she finally arrived at her penthouse, she went straight to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed, feeling more alone than she had in years. Meanwhile, across town, Chloe's shift had ended, and she found herself sitting in the empty break room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized herself, her cheeks flushed with adrenaline, her hair slightly disheveled. She felt exhausted, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Carlos appeared in the doorway, a concerned frown creasing his brow. "Chloe, you okay? You've been in here for a while." Chloe managed a weak smile. "Yeah, just processing, I guess." Carlos leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. "I gotta say, you were incredible out there. I don't know if I would have been able to keep my cool like that." "I don't know if I did," Chloe admitted, rubbing her hands together to keep them from shaking. I've seen people in desperate situations before, you know? At the shelter when they come in and they have nowhere else to go. You just act. You do what needs to be done." Carlos nodded slowly. "Still, it's pretty amazing what you did, even after everything she said to you." Chloe shrugged, trying to brush off the compliment. But Carlos's words lingered in her mind as she gathered her things and headed out into the night. As she walked the familiar route to her apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, about the way her face had crumpled with fear, about the vulnerability she had seen in her eyes. It wasn't that Chloe expected gratitude or even an apology, but she wondered if what had happened tonight would change anything. Would Margaret wake up tomorrow and continue on as if nothing had happened? Or would she remember the fear, the desperation that had brought them to this moment? As Chloe turned the corner and saw the lights of her apartment building ahead, she shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She had learned a long time ago not to expect too much from people like Margaret, but a small, stubborn part of her couldn't help hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The next morning, Margaret woke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering through her bedroom windows. She lay in bed for a long time, staring up at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. Her throat still felt raw, a physical reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. She thought about calling her friends, but the idea made her feel tired. She knew they would offer her sympathy and reassurance, but none of it would ease the sense of shame that gnawed at her. They wouldn't understand what it felt like to look into Chloe's eyes and see herself reflected back, not as the confident, untouchable woman she had always tried to be, but as someone small and afraid. Margaret finally dragged herself out of bed and walked to the window, looking out over the city. Her penthouse offered a breathtaking view of the skyline, but today it felt more like a gilded cage than a refuge. She realized that she didn't want to go back to being the person she had been yesterday, the person who found amusement in making others feel small. Without giving herself time to second guess, Margaret grabbed her phone and looked up the address for Safe Haven, the shelter she had heard Chloe mention once in passing. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen, but then she pressed the call. A voice answered on the other end, warm and welcoming. Safe Haven Shelter. How can I help you? Margaret swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dried. Hi, yes, I'd like to volunteer. The next afternoon, Chloe arrived at Safe Haven for her volunteer shift, her mind still replaying the events of the previous night. She found comfort in the familiar routine, sorting donations, setting out food trays, chatting with the regulars who had come to depend on the shelter's resources. But a part of her mind kept drifting back to Margaret, wondering what had happened after she left the restaurant. She was in the middle of arranging a row of donated winter coats when a shadow fell across the doorway. Chloe glanced up, expecting to see one of the regular volunteers, but instead she found herself staring at Margaret Wells. Margaret was out of place among the chipped linoleum floors and peeling paint, her designer coat and perfectly styled hair at odds with the worn-out faces that filled the shelter. For a moment, Chloe thought she might be imagining things. But then Margaret stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides, her expression hesitant. Chloe. Hi. Chloe blinked, unable to hide her surprise. Margaret, what are you doing here? Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze darting around the room. I wanted to see the place, the shelter. I thought I might be able to help. Chloe stared at her, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was uncertainty and something else. Maybe hope. She thought about turning Margaret away, telling her that she wasn't needed here, but then she thought about the families who could benefit from an extra set of hands, and the look in Margaret's eyes last night when Chloe had saved her life. Okay, Chloe said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Let's see what you can do. Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief, and Chloe let her inside, wondering if this was truly the beginning of a change, or just another moment that would slip away like so many before it. The air inside Safe Haven buzzed with the usual activity. Families gathering for meals, volunteers sorting through donations, and kids chasing each other through the halls. The shelter was a patchwork of life and resilience, a place where Chloe had found a sense of purpose beyond the polished floors of Maison d'Elegance. But today, as she watched Margaret fumble with a stack of food trays, Chloe couldn't help but feel like the entire building was holding its breath. Margaret looked more out of place than ever, dressed in a casual jacket that still screamed luxury. She moved stiffly, her hands unsure as she followed Chloe's instructions. Chloe caught her sneaking glances at the shelter's worn walls, at the people who shuffled through the line for lunch, their clothes threadbare, and their faces lined with exhaustion. For once, Margaret's expression wasn't one of disdain. It was closer to confusion, as if she were trying to fit this new reality into the world she knew. Here, you can start with the sandwiches, Chloe said, guiding Margaret to a table piled high with bread and cold cuts. Just make as many as you can. We have a lot of mouths to feed. Margaret nodded, swallowing as she glanced at the other volunteers, who offered her a mixture of polite nods and curious stares. She set to work, her movements clumsy at first, but slowly growing steadier as she got the hang of the task. Chloe watched from the corner of her eye, waiting for the inevitable complaints or for Margaret to slip back into her old habits. But to her surprise, Margaret stayed focused, her brow furrowed in concentration. After about an hour, Chloe brought over a few more loaves of bread, offering Margaret a tentative smile. You're doing okay. How are you holding up? Margaret looked up, brushing a stray hair from her face with the back of her hand. Her cheeks were flushed from the effort, but she managed a wry smile. I haven't made sandwiches since I was a kid. I didn't think it would be this tiring. Chloe nodded, her own smile growing a little warmer. It's not easy, but it's important. You're doing fine. Margaret seemed to take heart from the compliment, and for a moment they stood there in a companionable silence, working side by side. Chloe wondered if this truce could last, or if it was just a temporary reprieve in the ongoing battle between their worlds. The next weekend, Margaret returned to the shelter, this time bringing Hannah and Lily with her. Chloe was surprised to see them waiting by the entrance, both looking as uncertain as Margaret had on her first day. Hannah fidgeted with her scarf, casting a nervous glance toward the families entering the building, while Lily adjusted her glasses, her usual aloof expression, replaced by something closer to anxiety. Chloe crossed her arms, studying the three of them. "You're back," she said, her tone more skeptical than welcoming. "And you brought friends." Margaret gave her a sheepish smile. "They wanted to help, if that's okay." Hannah stepped forward, her voice hesitant. I know we haven't exactly made a good impression, Chloe, but after everything that happened, we realized we've never really done anything meaningful. I don't want to just go back to the way things were." Lily nodded, a faint flush creeping up her neck. "We thought maybe we could, you know, try to make a difference. If you'll let us." Chloe looked at them, wondering if she was being naive to think they could change. But she remembered the terror in Margaret's eyes that night, the way she had clung to life with every ounce of strength she had. Chloe had seen people at their most vulnerable before, at the shelter, in the aftermath of disasters, and she had learned that sometimes people could surprise you. She exhaled slowly, nodding. "Okay, but I'm not going to go easy on you just because you're new. There's a lot to do, and I expect you to keep up." Margaret grinned, a flicker of relief passing across her face. "Deal." Over the next few weeks, Margaret, Hannah, and Lily continued volunteering at Safe Haven. They struggled with the physical demands at first, sorting through boxes of donated clothes, serving hot meals in the crowded cafeteria, cleaning up after long lines of people who shuffled through, carrying their few possessions in tattered bags. Margaret's hands ached from scrubbing pots in the shelter's small, under-equipped kitchen. Hannah found herself coaxing a shy little girl into taking her lunch, the child's wary eyes reminding her of her own younger cousins. Lily, usually so composed, seemed taken aback by the desperation in the faces of the shelter's residents, her usual veneer of detachment cracking as she helped an elderly man find a coat that fit. At the end of each shift, the three of them would gather with Chloe, their faces flushed with effort, their clothes smudged with grime. Margaret found herself listening more than she spoke, her usual need to control every conversation giving way to the realization that she had so much to learn. One afternoon, after a particularly hectic lunch rush, Chloe and Margaret found themselves alone in the kitchen, washing dishes together. The water ran hot over their hands as they scrubbed plates, the rhythmic sound of clinking dishes filling the silence. Margaret glanced at Chloe, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't realize how much work this would be," she admitted, her voice low. "But it feels different than I thought it would. It feels good." Chloe raised an eyebrow, glancing sideways at her. "Good how?" Margaret hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, like I'm actually doing something that matters. Like I don't know, not as empty." Chloe said nothing for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Helping people has a way of doing that. It reminds you that there's more to life than just things." Margaret met her gaze, and for the first time, Chloe thought she saw a real spark of understanding in those bright blue eyes. Maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to bridge the gap between their worlds. While Margaret, Hannah, and Lily began to settle into their new routine at the shelter, Claire remained conspicuously absent. She continued to join their branches and social gatherings, but her tone turned increasingly defensive whenever the subject of volunteering came up. "I just don't see why you're all so obsessed with this place," Claire said one Sunday over mimosas, frowning as Margaret described the latest event they were planning. "There are professionals who do that kind of thing. Why should we spend our time doing their jobs?" Hannah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing at Lily for support. "It's not about doing their jobs, Claire. It's about connecting with people, seeing a side of life we'd never even thought about before." Margaret sipped her drink, studying Claire over the rim of her glass. "Maybe you should come with us one day. See it for yourself." Claire scoffed, crossing her arms. "And get my hands dirty? No, thank you. Besides, I don't think a few hours a week at some shelter is going to change anything. It's not like you can just fix people's problems overnight." Margaret's expression hardened, but she forced herself to keep her voice calm. "It's not about fixing everything, Claire. It's about being there when people need help the most. And maybe realizing that we're not as different from them as we think." Claire rolled her eyes, but she shifted in her seat, her expression more uncertain than she'd care to admit. Margaret watched her carefully, wondering if she would ever understand, or if she was doomed to stay trapped in her own bubble. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to think about ways to have a bigger impact on Safe Haven. She watched Chloe coordinate donations and manage the chaos with a sense of purpose that Margaret envied, and she wanted to find a way to help that went beyond just volunteering her time. One evening, as they wrapped up a shift, Margaret caught up with Chloe outside the shelter. The air was crisp, their breath fogging in front of them as they walked down the sidewalk. The city's lights glittered in the distance, but here in the quieter part of town, everything felt more grounded. "Chloe, I've been thinking," Margaret began, shoving her hands into her pockets. "The shelter, it needs more than just volunteers, doesn't it? It needs money, real support." Chloe glanced at her, surprised by the intensity in Margaret's voice. "Yeah, we're always struggling to keep up. There's never enough for what we need." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her courage. What if I organized a fundraiser? Something big. I have connections, people who might be willing to donate if they saw what the shelter was doing. I could host a charity event, use the same skills I used for those ridiculous parties. Chloe raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. A fundraiser? For the shelter? Why not? Margaret's expression was earnest, almost pleading. "I know I've made mistakes, Chloe. I know I have a lot to make up for. But this could actually make a difference. Please, let me try." Chloe hesitated, searching Margaret's face for any sign of ulterior motives. But all she saw was sincerity, a kind of desperation that she recognized from the people she had helped at the shelter, people who just wanted a chance to make things right. Finally, Chloe nodded. "Okay, Margaret, let's do it. But it's going to take a lot of work, and I'm not going to let you off easy." Margaret's smile was genuine, and for the first time, Chloe saw a glimpse of the person Margaret might become, a person who could use her privilege for something other than her own comfort. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Margaret threw herself into the preparations for the fundraiser, with a determination that surprised even her friends. She booked a venue, arranged catering, and reached out to her old social circle, pitching the event as the perfect way to give back. Hannah and Lily joined in eagerly, using their connections to secure donations for the silent auction and rallying more volunteers. The shelter buzzed with excitement as word of the gala spread. Chloe found herself swept up in the preparations, guiding Margaret through the practicalities of what the shelter needed most. They spent late nights working side by side, poring over lists of auction items, budgeting for expenses, and strategizing about how to reach more donors. One evening, as they finalized the guest list, Chloe looked up from her laptop and met Margaret's gaze. "Why are you doing all this, Margaret?" "Really?" Margaret hesitated, her expression thoughtful as she leaned back in her chair. I think I'm tired of being the person I was before. And I'm scared too. Scared of ending up empty and alone, without ever doing anything that matters." Chloe studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, you're doing something that matters now. Let's make sure it counts." Margaret smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she felt like she might be on the right path. As the gala approached, Margaret, Hannah, and Lily threw themselves into the preparations with a passion that surprised even them. But Claire remained distant, her skepticism lingering. She attended their planning meetings half-heartedly, offering curt remarks about the event's practicality and grumbling about the time commitment. But one evening, while driving through the city, Claire found herself passing by Safe Haven. She glanced out the window, noticing a line of people waiting outside the shelter's doors in the biting cold, huddled under thin blankets and shivering against the wind. For a moment, Claire thought about continuing on, but then she remembered the look in Margaret's eyes as she described her vision for the gala, the urgency in her voice that Claire hadn't heard in years. Claire hesitated, then pulled over to the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She didn't know why she did it, but she found herself walking up to the shelter's entrance, her heels clicking against the pavement. Inside, she saw Chloe working with Carlos and the other volunteers, setting up cots and handing out blankets. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched a mother tuck her two small children into one of the cots, her face etched with exhaustion. She thought of all the times she had brushed off Margaret's talk about the shelter, refusing to see the reality of what they were trying to do. Taking a deep breath, Claire stepped inside, catching Chloe's eye. Chloe straightened, clearly startled to see her, but she managed a polite smile. "Claire, what are you doing here?" Claire's voice wavered, but she held her head high. I, I'd like to help, if there's something I can do." Chloe studied her for a moment, then nodded, offering her a pile of blankets. "We could use all the help we can get." As Claire joined the volunteers, a sense of humility settled over her. She wasn't sure if this was the beginning of a real change, but as she watched the families huddled together for warmth, she knew one thing for certain. There was more to life than what she had known. The night of the charity gala arrived with an air of excitement and anticipation. Margaret had chosen a grand ballroom at one of the city's historic hotels, a space that struck a balance between elegance and warmth. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the tables, which were adorned with floral centerpieces and framed photos of Safe Haven's residents, images of the people and families the event was meant to support. Chloe arrived early, helping the staff with last-minute preparations. She moved through the space in a simple but elegant dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. As she adjusted a display of auction items, vacation packages, donated art pieces, and high-end gift baskets, she caught sight of Margaret across the room, directing the setup of the stage with calm authority. Margaret was a different person from the one Chloe had first met in the restaurant. Her once perfectly styled hair was now slightly windblown, and her expression held a focused determination rather than the cold confidence of their first encounter. She glanced over at Chloe and offered a nervous smile. "How's everything looking?" Margaret asked, joining her at the auction table. Chloe surveyed the room, taking in the steady stream of guests arriving, each with a curiosity and excitement that had been absent during their usual social gatherings. "Honestly, I think you've outdone yourself, Margaret. It's beautiful." Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly at the compliment, but she still looked anxious. "I just hope it's enough. I want people to really see what the shelter does, to understand why it matters." Chloe reached out, squeezing Margaret's hand briefly. "They'll see. You've made sure of that." Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath as she prepared herself to face the crowd. As the ballroom filled with the city's elite, business leaders, socialites, and even a few public figures, Margaret caught sight of Hannah, Lily, and Claire greeting guests at the entrance. Claire, who had been so reluctant at first, now wore a determined expression as she handed out information about the shelter and guided donors toward the silent auction. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a sense of belonging, a sense that she was part of something bigger than herself. As the evening unfolded, the guests mingled among the auction items, sipping champagne and discussing the shelter's mission with genuine curiosity. Chloe moved through the room, introducing donors to some of the shelter's success stories, former residents who had found jobs and housing with the help of Safe Haven. She noticed the way people's faces softened as they listened, their hearts opening to the cause. After the dinner service concluded, the lights dimmed slightly and Margaret took to the stage. The murmur of conversation faded as she gripped the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers, and found Chloe's reassuring gaze near the front of the room. "Good evening, everyone," Margaret began, her voice wavering for a moment before she steadied herself. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I know that many of you are used to attending events like this, gala fundraisers for worthy causes, but tonight is different for me, and I hope it will be different for you too." She paused, gathering her thoughts as the crowd watched her intently. "A few months ago, I nearly lost my life. It happened in a place where I thought I was in control, surrounded by comfort and luxury. But when I needed help most, the person who saved me wasn't someone from my world. It was Chloe Parker, a woman I had treated horribly, someone I had looked down on without ever really seeing." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued, her words ringing out into the quiet room. "That night, I realized how small my world had become, how focused I was on the surface, on what people wore or where they came from, instead of what they had to offer. Chloe showed me that there's so much more to life than I ever imagined, and she introduced me to a place that has changed my life. Safe Haven." She gestured toward a display at the front of the room, where photographs of families, volunteers, and scenes from the shelter's daily life were projected on a screen. Safe haven is more than just a shelter. It's a place where people find hope when they've lost everything. It's a place where small acts of kindness can mean the difference between despair and a second chance. And tonight, I'm asking all of you to help us give those second chances. Margaret took a breath, her voice softening with emotion. I don't deserve to stand here and ask for your support, but I know that the people at Safe Haven do. So please join me in making a difference. Let's help them find a way forward. The room was silent for a moment as Margaret's words settled over the crowd. Then, one by one, the guests began to applaud, their clapping swelling into a standing ovation. Chloe felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched Margaret step back from the microphone, her face flushed with a mixture of relief and pride. For the first time, Chloe believed that Margaret's change was real, that she truly understood the value of what she was fighting for. As the applause faded, the event's host took over, inviting the guests to participate in the live auction. Items were presented one by one: artwork, weekend getaways, and luxury experiences, each one selling for amounts that far exceeded their expected values. Chloe moved through the crowd, helping to keep track of the winning bids and coordinating with the volunteers. Toward the end of the auction, Claire surprised everyone by stepping up to the stage. Her voice wavered slightly as she addressed the room, but she held her chin high. I'd like to make a personal contribution, she announced, her voice carrying over the murmurs of surprise. In addition to my donation tonight, I'm pledging to cover the cost of the shelter's meal service for the next 6 months. I believe this place deserves our support. Margaret blinked, her eyes widening as she watched Claire speak. She felt a surge of pride as the crowd responded with enthusiastic applause. She hadn't expected Claire to embrace the cause so fully, but she realized that this journey had changed them both in ways they hadn't anticipated. As Claire stepped down from the stage, she met Chloe's gaze and gave a small, self-conscious shrug. I figured it was time I did something that wasn't all about me, she said quietly. Chloe smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. I think you just made a big difference, Claire. Thank you. By the end of the night, the gala had raised over $300,000 for Safe Haven, far surpassing the goal Margaret had set. As the final guests filed out of the ballroom, many of them stopped to shake Chloe's hand or offer words of support. A few even mentioned their plans to visit the shelter in the coming weeks. Chloe felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of generosity. She had always believed that people could come together to create change, but seeing it happen on such a large scale was a different experience entirely. As she gathered her things, preparing to head back to the shelter with the leftover donations, she felt a sense of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Margaret joined her near the entrance, her expression tired but glowing with satisfaction. We did it, Chloe, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I still can't believe it. Chloe turned to her, her eyes softening. You did a great job, Margaret. I think you might have a future in this whole philanthropy thing. Margaret laughed, a real unguarded laugh that filled the emptying ballroom. Maybe I'll take that as a compliment. She paused, her smile fading as she turned serious. Thank you, Chloe, to give me a chance, for believing that I could do better. Chloe nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. Everyone deserves a second chance, Margaret. Even people like us. The weeks following the gala brought a sense of renewed purpose to Safe Haven. The funds allowed the shelter to expand its programs, adding more beds, improving the kitchen facilities, and launching new initiatives to help residents find permanent housing. Chloe threw herself into the work, coordinating with the new volunteers and welcoming the increased support from donors. Margaret, Hannah, and Lily continued to volunteer regularly, each of them finding their own place within the shelter's bustling operations. Claire, who had once been the most skeptical, now showed up twice a week to help with the after-school program for kids. She had a surprising knack for reading stories aloud, and the children adored her animated voices. One afternoon, as Chloe and Margaret finished organizing a shipment of donated winter coats, they took a moment to rest on the steps outside the shelter. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city as cars rumbled past on the street. You know, I never thought I'd feel so fulfilled, Margaret admitted, staring out at the horizon. For so long, I thought happiness was about being admired, about having more than everyone else. But now, it's like I finally found something real. Chloe nodded, feeling a deep sense of understanding. I get it. It's the same for me. There's something about knowing you're making a difference, even in a small way. It changes you. Margaret glanced at her, a small smile playing on her lips. Do you think I've really changed, Chloe? Or am I just pretending to be better? Chloe met her gaze, seeing the uncertainty in Margaret's eyes. I think change takes time, but I also think you're trying, and that's what matters. The rest, it'll come if you keep moving forward. Margaret let out a slow breath, a look of relief passing over her face. Thank you. That means more than you know. As autumn gave way to winter, Chloe received an offer to join a disaster relief organization she had dreamed of working with. The opportunity meant traveling to other parts of the country to help communities affected by natural disasters, a chance to make an even bigger impact. But it also meant leaving behind safe haven and the friendships she had forged with Margaret and the others. Chloe struggled with the decision, torn between her desire to follow her calling and her loyalty to the shelter that had become her home. She finally shared the news with Margaret one evening as they locked up the shelter after a late shift. Margaret's eyes widened, but after a moment she broke into a proud smile. Chloe, that's amazing. I'm going to miss you, but I know this is exactly what you're meant to do. Chloe's throat tightened as she hugged Margaret, the reality of their goodbye settling in. I'll miss you too, but I know Safe Haven is in good hands with you. The night before Chloe left, Margaret, Hannah, Lily, and Claire organized a small farewell party at the shelter, inviting the other volunteers and a few residents. The group gathered in the main dining area, which was decorated with string lights and homemade signs, wishing Chloe luck on her next adventure. Margaret gave a heartfelt toast, her voice wavering as she spoke about how much Chloe had taught her. You changed our lives, Chloe. You taught us that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued. I promise we'll keep working to make this place as special as you always knew it could be. Chloe blinked back tears, feeling a warmth spread through her chest as she looked around at the familiar faces, the people she had helped, the friends she had made. Thank you, all of you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I'd find a place where I truly felt like I belonged. But you gave me that, and I'll carry it with me wherever I go. As she spoke, she realized that this wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the beginning of something new, for all of them. In the weeks after Chloe left, the impact of the gala and the changes at Safe Haven continued to ripple through the city. Margaret, Hannah, Lily, and Claire kept their promise, organizing new fundraisers, coordinating community events, and expanding the shelter's reach. They became known as passionate advocates for those in need, using their influence to raise awareness and support for local charities. Inspired by their example, other members of their social circle began to take notice. Donations to Safe Haven increased, and new volunteers arrived each week, eager to contribute to the cause. Margaret often thought of Chloe, imagining her out there in the world, helping people who had lost everything, and she knew that wherever Chloe went, her spirit of kindness and compassion would continue to inspire others. On a quiet winter evening, Margaret stood outside the shelter, watching as snowflakes drifted down from the sky, coating the city in a soft white blanket. The doors of Safe Haven opened, and a group of children ran out, their laughter ringing through the cold air as they played in the snow. Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her as she watched them, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She had found a purpose beyond herself, a reason to wake up each morning with hope in her heart. And somewhere far away, Chloe drove down a new road, the memory of Safe Haven and the people she had met there warming her from within. She knew that no matter how far she traveled, she would carry a piece of that place with her, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. If you enjoyed this story about redemption, friendship, and the power of kindness, be sure to like and subscribe to stay updated on more inspiring stories. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching.